My parents kicked me out for dating a foreigner. Years later, they came asking for money from the man they hated. My coffee maker picked that exact morning to give up on me, and I stood there in my tiny kitchen with my work badge in one hand and a spoon in the other, staring at the dead machine like it had personally betrayed me. My phone kept buzzing on the counter, and every buzz was another message from my mother with the same vibe. Urgent, dramatic, and somehow still vague. Like she wanted me nervous without giving me the courtesy of information. I finally turned the phone face down because I already knew what it was about before I even read it. Christmas. It was Christmas. Christmas always knows how to drag old stuff back up, so I'm going to rewind for a second. I'm Arden, and I grew up in the kind of family where my younger sister was treated like a shiny trophy, and I was treated like the person hired to hold the trophy steady for photos. My parents loved to say they were fair, which was hilarious in the way a bad joke is hilarious when you're too tired to argue. If my sister brought home average grades, my father would act like she'd cured something. And if I brought home straight A's, my mother would say, "That's nice, honey," and immediately ask if my sister had eaten. They never said, "We like her more," because people like that don't say the quiet part out loud, but they made sure I felt it anyway. I learned early that pushing back only got me labeled dramatic, so I got good at swallowing things, smiling, and saving my anger for later when I was alone. In college, I met this guy I would eventually marry, and I'm going to avoid sounding like a romance commercial here, but he was the first person who looked at me like I wasn't background noise. He wasn't from the same place as me, and yeah, that mattered to my parents in the worst way. He was finishing school on a visa, working the kind of jobs everyone says are respectable until they're done by someone with an accent. And he had this calm, steady way of talking that made me feel safe even when I was spiraling. We tried to keep things quiet for a while because I knew my family, and he didn't want to be the reason I got dragged through the mud, but feelings don't ask permission. When I finally brought him to my parents' house, I made myself believe they'd try. I even bought a pie from a little bakery near campus because I wanted the moment to feel normal, like a daughter introducing the person she loved and getting awkward hugs and too many questions. Instead, my father shook his hand like he was touching something suspicious. And my mother did that tight smile that means she's already decided you're a problem. My father asked where he was from, then asked what his real plan was, and then, with a straight face, suggested he was only with me to get a green card. I remember holding the pie like it was a shield, and I remember my cheeks burning, not because I was ashamed of my boyfriend, but because I was ashamed of them. My sister sat there on the couch scrolling on her phone, barely hiding her smirk, like this was entertainment. On the drive back, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I kept replaying my father's words in my head, thinking of all the times I'd begged my parents to see me as a real person and not a problem to manage. My boyfriend kept saying it was okay, that he'd seen worse, but I could tell it hurt anyway. The worst part was how familiar the pain felt, like I'd walked back into a room I'd escaped, and my brain immediately went into survival mode. That night, my mother sent a message that said, "We need to talk about your choices." And I stared at it so long my eyes watered, because I knew exactly what was coming, and I hated that part of me still wanted their approval. Yes, I know, don't yell at me. By the time the stores started putting out fake pine garlands in early fall, my mother had already decided Christmas would be the stage where she proved I was the villain. She texted me little reminders like, "We're keeping things simple this year," which sounded harmless until you understood her language, because simple always meant controlled. My father called once, not to ask how school was going or how my job search was going, but to say very casually that bringing my boyfriend to family events was going to make people talk. People meaning their friends from church, their neighbors, the random aunties who treat gossip like cardio. I said, maybe a little too sharp, that I didn't care what people thought. And my father went quiet. In that way, that means he's about to punish you emotionally. Christmas Eve rolled around and my parents insisted we do dinner right after the service. The same routine they'd forced on us forever, and I got told point blank that I should come alone. My mother didn't even pretend it was about space or timing. She said she didn't want drama at the table, which was rich because she is the drama. I asked if my sister's boyfriend was invited, and she said, "He's practically family," like the words were automatic. When I pushed, she hit me with, "Arden, don't make this about you," which is a sentence my family loves so much I'm surprised they don't embroider it on pillows. So I went alone. I showed up with a bottle of sparkling juice because I didn't want to arrive empty-handed. And I remember standing in their hallway taking my coat off while I listened to my sister laughing in the living room. I walked in and there he was, her boyfriend, sitting right next to my father like they were already related. wearing one of those sweaters people wear in December because they want to look wholesome. My father clapped him on the shoulder and said, loud enough for everyone, "Now that's a young man who belongs here." I felt my stomach drop, like my body understood the insult before my brain even caught up. At the table, my mother kept steering the conversation away from me like I was a pothole. If I mentioned my job interview, she'd interrupt to ask my sister how her hair appointment went. If I mentioned that my boyfriend got an internship, my father would say something like, "Well, as long as he's doing it the right way," and then wink at my sister's boyfriend like they were sharing a joke. I sat there chewing food I couldn't taste, smiling so hard my face hurt, and trying not to cry because crying in that house gives them more ammunition. After dinner, one of my aunts cornered me near the sink and asked, in that too sweet whisper people use when they want to sound caring, where my boyfriend was. I told her my parents said he shouldn't come, and she made this little face, half pity and half judgment, and said, "Oh, honey," like I was a case study. That was the moment my anger finally started to heat up. Not in a clean, empowering way, but in a messy, humiliating way where I wanted to flip the whole table and also disappear into the floor. My mother called me later that night, crying dramatically, saying I was breaking my father's heart. And I remember holding the phone away from my ear thinking, how is it always my fault when they're the ones being cruel? When I got back to my apartment, my boyfriend was waiting up, sitting on the couch in sweats with 2 mugs of tea like he'd been bracing for impact. And the second I saw his face, the tears came. I told him everything in this rambling, ugly spill of words, and he listened without interrupting, which somehow made it worse, because I wanted him to tell me my parents were wrong in some dramatic speech. And instead, he held my hand and said very quietly, "I don't want to be the reason you lose them." And I said, "You're not." But even as I said it, I felt that old fear crawling up my throat because my family had trained me to believe love always comes with a threat. A couple months later, my sister announced her engagement like she was delivering world peace. And my parents reacted the way they always did when something good happened to her, like it validated their entire existence. They hosted this big celebration after church, with folding tables covered in red and green decorations even though it wasn't even December yet, because apparently the whole community needed to see how blessed they were. I went because I still had that stupid habit of showing up, hoping for scraps, and also because if I didn't go, my mother would tell everyone I was jealous and ungrateful. And I didn't have the energy to fight that rumor marathon. The room was packed with people who acted like they'd personally raised my sister, and every time someone hugged her and squealed, my mother would glance at me like she was checking if I looked miserable enough. My sister's boyfriend stood beside her, smiling like he'd won a prize, and my father couldn't stop talking about how traditional and right everything felt. He made a little speech, the kind with forced emotion, and he actually said out loud that he was proud his daughter chose someone who belongs here, someone we know the right way. I felt my jaw tighten so hard it hurt, because everyone knew I was with him by then, and everyone knew my boyfriend wasn't there because my parents didn't want him there, and my father still chose to perform that line like it was innocent. My sister found me near the back of the room later, holding a paper cup and pretending I cared about the dry cookies, and she smiled at me in that way that looks sweet from a distance and feels like a slap up close. She leaned in like she was sharing a secret and said, "It's crazy how different our lives turned out, isn't it?" And I said, "Congrats," because I was trying to be mature, and she added, softer, "At least mine makes sense." I swear I saw something almost excited in her eyes, like she was watching for my reaction the way kids watch a firework. I wanted to say something sharp back, something that would cut, but I could already hear my mother's voice in my head, telling me I was dramatic. So I swallowed it, and that was probably my biggest mistake in the long run. On the way home, I couldn't stop ranting in the car, and my boyfriend listened, and then he asked, gently, if I wanted to take a step back from my family for a while. Not forever, not in some dramatic burn-the-bridge way, just a boundary, a pause, a chance to breathe. And I wanted to say yes immediately, but instead I spiraled, because the thought of stepping away made me feel like a failure, like I couldn't handle my own parents, like I was weak. I know how that sounds. I told him I'd think about it, and that night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling this awful mix of anger and sadness and jealousy that I hated admitting even to myself. Because it wasn't jealousy of her relationship, not really. It was jealousy of how easily she got to belong. A few weeks after that party, something shifted in me. I started spending more time with my boyfriend's family, and the contrast was brutal. They asked me questions about my day and actually waited for answers. They laughed at my jokes like they liked me, not like they were tolerating me. His parents invited us over for dinner, and nobody acted like his presence was an inconvenience or a scandal. I remember sitting at their table and realizing my shoulders weren't tense for once, and it made me want to cry in this embarrassing, grateful way. My boyfriend tried too. He sent my parents a small gift for the holidays, something neutral and respectful, and my father returned it unopened. My mother sent a message saying, "Stop pushing," like basic decency was harassment. I watched my boyfriend's face when he read it, and I felt this cold, protective rage because he didn't deserve to be treated like that. And neither did I. And I finally started to wonder how much longer I could keep pretending this was normal. The proposal itself wasn't some fancy public spectacle, thank God, because if my fiancé had gotten down on one knee in a crowded restaurant, I probably would have panicked and started crying into someone's appetizer. He did it on a quiet weekend when we were home, still in pajamas, with our tiny living room smelling like cinnamon from a candle we'd lit to pretend we were adults with cozy hobbies. He said he wanted to choose me, officially, in a way nobody could take away, and I said yes so fast I almost knocked him over. I laughed and cried at the same time, which was not cute, it was more like an overwhelmed animal noise, and he looked relieved, like he'd been holding his breath for months. I made the mistake of posting a simple photo of my hand on a social media app later, because I wanted for 1 second to feel like other people feel when they share happy news. I got comments from friends, messages from classmates, even a couple coworkers, and then there was the silence from my parents. The silence lasted long enough to become its own message. 2 days later, my father called, and he didn't say hello, he didn't say congratulations, he said, "We need to talk about this before you embarrass us." My stomach clenched, and I knew exactly where it was going. He said the church community was already asking questions, that my mother was getting looks. Like that mattered more than my actual life. He kept saying my fiancé was using me, that I was naive, that I was throwing my future away. I tried to argue, and my father cut me off with, "You don't get it, Arden. You're not thinking about the family." My mother grabbed the phone mid-call, and I could hear her breathing hard like she'd been rehearsing tears. She said, "If you marry him, you're dead to us." And then she listed consequences like she was reading a menu. They'd take me out of their will. They'd cancel the car insurance that was still under their name because I'd been trying to save money while I finished school. I wasn't allowed to come to my grandmother's house anymore. She said it like she was protecting me from a bad decision, but it felt like she was threatening to erase me. I hung up and sat on my kitchen floor back against the cabinets, staring at the tile like it might explain something. My fiancé found me there and asked what happened, and I told him, and he went quiet, and I could see the guilt start to spread across his face. He said again that he didn't want to be the reason I lost my family, and this time I snapped. I said, probably too harsh, that I was already losing them long before he showed up. I told him about every birthday they forgot, every milestone they shrugged at, every time they used me as the responsible one so they could baby my sister. I said, "They don't want me, they want control." And hearing it out loud made me shake, because it meant I had to admit the truth. My sister called a few hours later, acting like she was concerned, and for about 30 seconds I almost believed her. She said, "I'm worried about Mom and Dad. They're upset." And then, like clockwork, she pivoted into telling me I should reconsider, because I was making everyone uncomfortable. I told her calmly that this wasn't about her. She laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Everything is about me, Arden, you hate that." And then she went off, accusing me of being selfish, of always needing attention, of being desperate to look rebellious. I remember gripping the phone so hard my fingers hurt and thinking, wow, she doesn't even see herself as cruel. She sees herself as honest. After that, my parents stopped responding to invitations, letters, even little attempts at peace. They refused to meet my fiancé. They refused to talk to me unless it was to demand I change. A cousin I trusted called to warn me my parents were telling people I was being manipulated by a foreigner, like my own brain had fallen out of my head. My fiancé asked me one night, softly, if I wanted to postpone the wedding, to lower the temperature. I stared at him and realized he was offering to shrink himself again to make my family more comfortable, and something in me hardened. I said, "No, I'm tired of apologizing for existing." On the morning of the wedding, I woke up before my alarm because my body was basically vibrating with nerves, and the first thing I did was check my phone like an idiot. I had this tiny, pathetic hope that my mother would text something like, "We're on our way," because hope is stubborn and embarrassing. Instead, there was a message from her that felt like it was written with a smile. She said they wouldn't be there, that I was choosing pride over family, and that this marriage was going to fail because I was being reckless. She ended it with, "Don't come crawling back," which was creative. I'll give her that. I stared at the screen and felt this weird mix of numbness and rage, like my brain couldn't decide which emotion deserved the spotlight. My husband knocked on the bathroom door asking if I was okay, and I lied and said yes, because it was our wedding day, and I didn't want to ruin it by letting my mother live in my head rent-free. At the little ceremony, his family showed up early, excited, bringing flowers and snacks and way too much enthusiasm. And it was sweet and also painful because every kind gesture highlighted the empty chair we saved for my parents. Someone asked casually if my family was running late, and I said they had other plans. And then I had to swallow hard because my voice tried to crack. Later that afternoon, my sister posted photos from a beach trip with my parents, smiling under the sun with captions about peace and family time. They did it on purpose. They wanted anyone who cared to see that they were choosing each other and excluding me, like it was a moral stand. I stared at those photos, handshaking. And then I did something impulsive and petty that I'm not proud of, but I'm also not sorry about. I blocked them all. My mother, my father, my sister, even my grandmother, because she always backed them up and I was tired of being the family scapegoat while she acted like she was above it. That night, after the guests left and the house got quiet, I sat on the edge of our bed, still wearing my wedding hair and half my makeup, and I finally let myself feel it. I cried until my face hurt, and my husband held me and kept whispering that I wasn't alone, and I believed him. But it still felt like someone had cut a piece out of me. I kept thinking about how my parents could skip their own daughter's wedding and sleep fine, and then I kept thinking about how they weren't skipping me really. They were punishing me, and that was the difference. Punishment means you mattered enough to control. After the honeymoon, which was basically a cheap weekend trip because we were broke, real life hit fast. We moved apartments twice in 1 year because rent kept jumping, and we took whatever jobs we could get. I worked in an office where my boss acted like the building would collapse if I took a lunch break, and my husband picked up extra shifts whenever he could because the paperwork and fees around his immigration situation were a constant drain. It wasn't some dramatic nightmare. It was the steady grind of trying to build a life while money kept slipping through our fingers. We argued about stupid things like groceries and utility bills, and then we'd apologize and make up, because we were both exhausted and trying. Every holiday season, my mother would try to creep back in through distant relatives, like sending messages through my aunt, or having my grandmother leave a voicemail that sounded like a prayer and a threat at the same time. I didn't respond. I told myself I was protecting my peace. Some days it felt true. Other days it felt like I was grieving someone who was still alive. 7 years went by like that. Quiet on their end, loud in my head, and I honestly thought the story would end there. I thought the punishment would be permanent. And in a weird way, that was easier, because at least it was consistent. Those 7 years were a blur of normal stress, the kind that doesn't make headlines but still ages you. We saved in messy little ways, like cutting subscriptions, skipping vacations, buying secondhand furniture that looked fine until you sat on it and heard a terrifying crack. We drove 2 used cars that both had their own personalities. And by personalities, I mean weird noises and dashboard lights that popped on at random, like they were trying to keep us humble. I got promoted once. Not because anyone cared about my dreams, but because I was dependable and my boss loved squeezing extra work out of people who didn't complain enough. My husband finally got stable work in his field, and when I say stable, I mean we could breathe a little. Not like we became rich overnight. Eventually, we bought a small house, the kind with a yard you have to fight weeds in, and a mortgage that stretches out for 30 years like a sentence you sign willingly. The day we got the keys, I sat in the empty living room on the floor and laughed and cried at the same time, because it hit me that my parents had missed every step that led there. They missed my late nights studying, they missed the job interviews, they missed the months where we were counting coins for groceries, they missed all of it, and they chose that, because their pride mattered more. A cousin kept me updated sometimes, not in a dramatic way, more like casual gossip, and I let it happen because I'm human and curiosity is a disease. I heard my sister had her big wedding, the one my parents paid for, with matching outfits and long speeches about family values, and I heard she posted photos like she was in a magazine. I heard my father brag to anyone who would listen about gaining a real son-in-law. I also heard the marriage wasn't as perfect as it looked, but I didn't know details and I told myself I didn't care. I cared a little. I'm not going to pretend. When someone spends years acting like you're the mistake, you want proof the universe isn't rewarding them for it. Once in a while, late at night, I'd scroll old messages from my mother like a masochist to remind myself why I stayed away. It wasn't that I missed them as people. I missed the idea of parents, the idea of being claimed and loved without conditions. but every time I pictured going back. I also pictured my mother crying on purpose, my father with his cold voice, my sister with that smile, and my stomach would knot up like it was warning me. So when my grandmother called out of nowhere one afternoon, her name lighting up my screen like a ghost, I froze. I almost let it go to voicemail because what good had ever come from that family reaching out? But then I answered, because I'm still me. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered, but the entitlement was the same. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask about my house. She said, "You need to unblock your parents," like she was telling me to pick up milk. I said, "Why?" And she sighed like I was being difficult on purpose. She told me something was happening with my sister, something serious, and that my father needed to tell me himself. She kept saying, "This affects all of us," which is a weird thing to say if you actually care about the person you're calling. And then she slipped and admitted her own house was tied to it because she co-signed and put her house up as collateral. My throat went dry because that sounded like money trouble, and money trouble is the only language my family suddenly respects. I asked for specifics and she dodged, and that made me suspicious, because if they were truly victims, they'd be desperate to show me proof, not desperate to hide details. Still, I unblocked them. I stared at their names on my phone like I was opening a door I'd nailed shut, and I waited a full day before calling, because part of me wanted to see if they would reach out first, if they'd actually miss me, or if they'd wait for me to do the emotional labor again. They didn't. When I finally called my parents, my father answered on the second ring, like he'd been sitting there staring at his phone waiting, and there was this long silence where neither of us knew how to start. He didn't say my name at first. He said, "Hello," like I was a stranger, and because technically I was, according to him, I said, "It's Arden," and he said, "Yeah." And then another silence, and I could hear my mother's voice faintly in the background, like she was hovering and coaching. My father cleared his throat and launched into a story without any warmth, which was also very on brand. He said my sister's husband had left and blocked everyone, and that he took money with him, and my father kept using that word, money, like he was tasting it. He said it like the betrayal was primarily financial, and my brain immediately lit up with suspicion, because if your daughter gets abandoned, you usually lead with your daughter, not your wallet. My father said they'd trusted him because he claimed he knew investments, that he could help them build wealth, and now everything was falling apart. I asked what he meant by investments, and he started talking in vague terms about retirement accounts and pulling money out early, and he said they used some kind of credit line against their house. He tried to sound like a victim of genius manipulation, but there were these little pauses where you could tell he was picking words carefully, like he was editing out something that made him look worse. When I asked why they hadn't called the police, he said, "It's complicated." And the way he rushed past it told me complicated meant signatures and paperwork, and my grandmother signing things she didn't understand. It wasn't even the words. It was the way he avoided that question like it was radioactive. Then he did something that made my skin crawl. He apologized, sort of. He said, "We were wrong about your husband," in this flat voice that didn't match the weight of what he'd done. And then he immediately followed it with, "We need to come together as a family now." It felt like he was handing me a fake apology as a key to unlock my bank account, and I hated how quickly my chest tightened, because a part of me still wanted that apology to be real. The call ended without any real details, my father insisting we'd talk again soon, and me saying I'd need proof of what happened. After I hung up, I sat at my desk staring at my computer screen without seeing it, and my husband walked in and asked why I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told him my father called for money, basically, and he didn't even look surprised, which made me feel both validated and sad. He said, "Whatever it is, we don't give them anything without clarity." And I nodded, but my stomach was already doing that nervous flip where you can tell something bigger is coming. The next day, my father called again, and this time he sounded more urgent, like the panic had finally broken through his pride. He mentioned casually that he knew we were stable now, because he'd heard through people, and I swear I felt violated, like he'd been watching my life from behind a curtain without ever stepping into it. He said it would be fair for me to help my sister because she'd had a baby and she was struggling, and I almost choked on my own spit because the audacity was unreal. I asked how he knew my life details after all these years, and he ignored that and kept going. I told him I'd need documents, bank letters, anything real. He got defensive instantly and blurted something about letters from the bank about the building, and then he stopped like he'd accidentally confessed. I said, "What building?" And he stuttered and tried to backpedal, saying he meant, paperwork. And then, like a magician desperate to distract you, he changed the subject and warned me not to involve the police because it would ruin my sister's life. That was the moment my suspicion solidified into certainty, because if someone stole from you, you don't protect them, unless you're not actually the victim you claim to be. I wrote down everything he said afterward in my notes app like I was collecting receipts, because I didn't trust my own brain not to second-guess itself later. Then I sat there thinking about my father, my proud, judgmental father, begging for help and still trying to control the narrative, and I realized he hadn't changed at all. He ran out of options. My sister called the next evening, and the second I saw her name, my stomach did that drop it always does, like my body remembers betrayal better than my brain does. I answered because curiosity is my toxic trait, and also because I wanted to hear her voice. Once, so I could measure whether she sounded guilty or scared or anything human. She started sweet, like weirdly sweet, saying she missed me, saying she thought about me, saying she hated how things ended, and I almost laughed out loud. Where was that energy when I got married? When I bought a house, when I existed for years without them? Then she got to the point so fast it gave me emotional whiplash. She said she needed help, real help, monthly help, like a couple thousand every month because she had a baby and bills and legal stuff and she was drowning. She said it like it was obvious I'd step in, like I was a backup plan she'd always kept in her pocket. I asked what happened with her husband, and she gave me this rehearsed story about him disappearing, about him taking money, about him being heartless. But the details were sloppy. She said he had no family, that he was basically alone in the world, and the way she said it was too quick, like she was trying to block off a path before I even walked it. I asked why she didn't go to the police, and she got defensive, saying she didn't want the father of her child to have a record, like she was protecting him. I said, "So he did something criminal, but you're protecting him?" And she snapped, "It's not like that." And then she corrected herself mid-sentence, like she realized she'd stepped on a crack in her own story. She started talking about how complicated relationships are, how people make mistakes, and then she slipped and said, "He didn't disappear exactly. He left because he had a thing going on." And then she rushed into, "Anyway," like the word anyway could erase what she'd admitted. I sat there in my office chair, gripping my phone, staring at the wall, and I felt this wave of anger so hot it made me dizzy. Not because she was lying, but because she was doing it with the same confidence she used when we were kids. The same confidence that came from knowing my parents would back her up no matter what. She tried to turn it into a guilt trip, saying if I cared about family, I wouldn't ask so many questions. I'd help. She literally said, "Stop interrogating me," which was wild because she called me for money, not the other way around. I told her, "I'm not sending you anything until I know the truth." And she went quiet for a second, and then she started crying. Except it didn't sound like real crying. It sounded like acting. She said I was cruel, that I was punishing an innocent baby, that I was jealous. Jealous. Of course, because she still couldn't imagine any universe where I had boundaries that weren't motivated by envy. I asked her calmly if our parents were asking her for money too, and she said, "They're helping as much as they can." And I heard the lie in her tone like a squeak in a cheap door. When the call ended, my hands were shaking, and my husband walked in with a bowl of leftovers and took one look at me and said, "What did she ask for?" I told him, and he sat down slowly like he needed a second to process the audacity. He said, "They cut you off for years and now they want you to fund their mess." And I nodded, because that was exactly it. And then he said something that stuck with me. If they were telling the truth, they wouldn't be afraid of you seeing paperwork. I knew he was right, but I still felt that pull, that old conditioning. The idea that if I didn't help, I was the bad daughter, the bad sister, the bad woman. It's amazing how deep family programming goes, even when you know it's toxic. So I called my parents back, and I said I wanted the full story, with dates, with receipts, with whatever they had. And my father got sharp, like I was being disrespectful. And my mother started crying in the background, saying I was attacking them during a crisis. And I realized in that moment that this wasn't going to be some clean conversation where they admit wrongdoing and we heal. This was going to be a fight. I called my cousin after that, the one person who'd always been kind to me in small, quiet ways, and I asked straight up what was going on. At first, my cousin tried to stay neutral, saying my parents were stressed and my sister was overwhelmed. And then I started listing the contradictions like I was reading from a script, and I heard my cousin exhale. That exhale was basically a confession. My cousin said there were bank letters at my parents' house, not one or two, but a stack, and they weren't about my sister's husband at all. They were about a property, not their house, something else. My cousin said the letters had words like default and sale on them, and my throat went cold. I asked what kind of property, and my cousin hesitated, and then said something about a small commercial building my father bought, supposedly as an investment. An investment. There it was again. That word my father kept tossing around like it was an excuse. I called my parents back immediately, and my father answered like he knew I was coming in hot. I said, "What building?" And my mother started yelling in the background before my father even spoke, saying my cousin had no right to talk to me, saying people were trying to turn me against them. I said, "You already did that." And my father snapped, "Watch your tone." Even in crisis, he couldn't help himself. He still wanted control, still wanted me to play the obedient daughter role. I told him I knew about the bank letters and the property, and there was this pause, this long, heavy pause, where I could almost hear him deciding whether to keep lying or not. My mother started crying louder, saying I was attacking them when they were desperate. And then she said something that made my blood boil. "If you loved your sister, you wouldn't be doing this. Like love equals silence. Like love equals letting them manipulate me." Then my grandmother texted me, not calling, texting, like she didn't want to risk her voice being heard on speaker. She wrote, "We didn't tell you the truth about him having no family because your father said you'd call his people and make it worse." I stared at that message so long my eyes went blurry, because it was the clearest proof I'd gotten so far that they were actively hiding things. They lied on purpose, as a strategy, not as an accident. I sent one message back to my grandmother, asking what she meant, and she didn't respond. Classic. She always wanted to stir the pot and then pretend her hands were clean. My pulse was loud in my ears, and my husband came into the room and asked if I was okay. And I told him, "They're lying." And he said, "I know," like he'd never doubted it. He offered to call a lawyer friend just for advice, and I almost said yes. But then I stopped myself, because I could already hear my father accusing me of trying to ruin my sister if I involved anyone official. I hated that. Even after years of distance, my father's voice could still reach into my brain, so I did it the messy way. I called again and again, and I refused to hang up until my father said the truth. I told him I wasn't sending money. I wasn't offering emotional comfort. I wasn't playing the family mediator role unless he stopped talking around the facts. I said, "Tell me what you actually did." And for the first time in my life, my father sounded tired. Not angry, not superior, just tired. He said quietly, "Fine. You want the whole truth?" And my mother screamed, "Don't!" Like truth itself was the enemy. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding, and I said, "Yes, the whole truth." My father started talking fast. Like if he got the words out quickly enough, they wouldn't sound as bad. And he admitted he bought a small commercial building because he wanted to do investments, like my sister's husband talked about. He said he wanted something that could bring in rental income, something to leave behind, something that would make him feel like a successful provider. And I know that desire, I get it in theory, but the way he said it, it wasn't humble, it was pride. Like he deserved a shortcut to wealth because he'd always considered himself the smartest person in the room. He admitted they pulled money out of a retirement account early and paid penalties, and they took a credit line against their house. And my stomach turned because that wasn't a small mistake. That was a huge, reckless gamble. He said the plan was to renovate the building and lease it out. But costs kept climbing, contractors kept asking for more, and things got delayed. He said my sister's husband warned him to slow down, to stop spending, to get real estimates. And my father ignored him. He said it like advice was an insult. Then he slipped into blaming, because he did. He said something like, "It all started because of him," meaning my husband somehow. And I cut him off so hard my voice surprised even me. I said, "No, you did that. You chose that." There was this silence where I could tell he wanted to argue but couldn't find a clean angle. My mother grabbed the phone and started sobbing, saying they were under pressure, saying they did it for the family, saying my sister deserved stability. Then she said in this broken, chaotic rush that there was more, that my sister made a mistake, and I felt my body go cold, because my mother doesn't confess things unless she has to. She said my sister had an affair, and the baby wasn't actually her husband's. My brain literally stalled. I just sat there staring at nothing, like my mind needed a second to catch up to my reality. My father came back on the line and sounded furious. Not at my sister, not at himself, but at the situation, like it was unfair life had consequences. He said my sister's husband didn't steal anything, he left. He demanded a paternity test. He demanded a divorce. And he refused to be involved in the building renovation, because why would he fund the project of a man who treated him like trash? My father admitted he'd expected him to work for free on weekends, to help manage paperwork, to fix things, and when he refused, my father took it personally. And then my sister grabbed the phone and started screaming, hysterical, accusing me of forcing it, like I was the one who created the mess by asking questions. She yelled that I always ruin things, that I always make everything about me, and I could hear my mother's voice trying to calm her down like she was soothing a child who threw a tantrum in a store. It was so familiar it almost made me numb. My father said the building loan was in trouble, that payments were behind, that the bank was sending notices, and that my grandmother's house was tied into it, which is why my grandmother called. He said they needed money to finish repairs and stop foreclosure, and he said it like it was a group project and I was the lazy teammate. I said, "So you cut me off for years. You smeared my husband, you skipped my wedding, and now you want me to save your investment?" And my father said, "We're family." The way he said it made me want to throw my phone into the wall. After the call ended, I sat there shaking, and my husband wrapped his arms around me from behind. And I realized I was laughing, but it wasn't funny laughter. It was the kind of laughter that happens when your brain is overloaded and needs an escape hatch. I kept repeating, "They didn't miss me, they missed what they think I can do for them." And my husband kept saying, "I know." And I felt this weird grief, not for them, but for the version of me that had still been hoping they'd come back with love. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while my brain replayed every part of the call like it was trying to find a loophole where my parents weren't the villains. I kept thinking about my sister's baby, and I felt this guilty pinch in my chest because a baby didn't ask for any of this, but then I'd think about my mother's voice saying I was dead to them, and my guilt would flip into anger again. Emotional whiplash is basically my cardio at this point. The next morning, my father texted like nothing had happened, like we'd just chatted about weather. He wrote, "We need to meet and talk about next steps." Next steps, like I was part of some board meeting. I replied that there were no next steps unless they accepted that I wasn't paying for their mistakes. He called immediately, and his first sentence was, "Don't be stubborn," which made me laugh out loud, because the person who gambled his house on a building was calling me stubborn. My mother got on the line and started with the tears again, saying they were going to lose everything, saying my grandmother was going to be on the street, saying my sister was scared and exhausted and postpartum and alone. And I'm not a monster, I felt something when she said postpartum, because I've watched friends go through that foggy, exhausted haze and it's brutal. Because there it was, the trade. Money for belonging. I told them, slowly, that I wasn't stable in the way they imagined. I told them we had a mortgage, we had car payments, we had repairs in our own house we were putting off because we weren't trying to drown in debt. I told them my promotion didn't mean I was rich. It meant my boss trusted me to do 2 jobs for 1 paycheck. I told them we had savings, but those savings were for emergencies, like a broken furnace, like medical bills, like actual emergencies, not for plugging the hole in my father's ego. My father scoffed and said, "You always make things sound harder than they are." And I wanted to scream, because that was the same dismissive tone he used when I was a kid with feelings he didn't want to deal with. My sister jumped onto the call again, because she couldn't help herself, and she said, "So you're just going to let us lose the house?" I said, "You didn't care when you were posting beach pictures on my wedding day." And she went silent for a beat. And then she said, "That was different." Different how? Because it benefited her. That's always the difference. My father tried to pivot into old authority, saying he was still my father, saying I owed him respect, and I felt something in me snap into clarity. I said, "You didn't want to be my father when I chose a husband you didn't approve of. You wanted to be my judge." My mother started yelling, saying I was twisting things, saying they were protecting me, and I said, "You were protecting your image." I could hear my husband's footsteps in the hallway, and he didn't interrupt, he just stood there, because he'd learned that sometimes I needed to fight my own fight. My father said, "If you help now, we can all move on." And I said, "Move on to what? Pretending you didn't treat me like garbage? Pretending my sister didn't cheat and then blame everyone else?" My sister screamed, "Stop talking about that," like I was the problem for naming it. And then, because I was tired and honestly a little cruel in that moment, I said, "Are you sure you want to protect the father of the baby so badly? Do you even like him? Or is he just the person who messed up your perfect story?" She started sobbing. And my mother started begging me to stop, and my father told me I was being heartless. I said, "No, I'm being honest." I told them the truth they didn't want, They didn't miss me. They missed what they thought I could provide. I said, "You rejected me for prejudice and control. And now you want me back because you're scared." My father tried one last time, saying family helps family, and I said, "Family doesn't skip weddings as a punishment." And then I hung up, and my hands were shaking, and I hated how powerful and miserable I felt at the same time. After that, messages poured in. My mother sent long paragraphs about sacrifice. My father sent short, cold texts about duty. My sister sent angry voice notes calling me selfish. And I sat there reading them like I was watching strangers perform a play I'd already memorized. And my husband asked me softly if I wanted to block them again. I said, "Not yet," because part of me still wanted a miracle where they suddenly understood, and I hated myself for that. 2 days after I hung up, my father sent a message that just said, "Meet us." No please, no address, just a command, like I was still 17 and grounded. I ignored it, and then my mother started calling over and over until my phone looked like it was being attacked. My husband asked me what I wanted, not what they wanted, and that question hit me harder than any of their guilt trips, because I realized I'd been reacting to them like a reflex. I told him I needed to see it with my own eyes, the paperwork, the reality, because otherwise my brain would keep doing that thing where it tries to soften the truth to protect the fantasy of having parents. So I agreed to meet them in a neutral place, a little coffee shop near their neighborhood, because I wasn't stepping back into their house like nothing happened. I got there early and sat in a corner with my coat still on, hands wrapped around a cup I wasn't even drinking, and I watched people come in and out with their normal problems, their normal conversations, and I felt weirdly jealous of them, because their lives looked uncomplicated, and mine was still tangled in the same family knots. My parents walked in like they owned the place. My father didn't hug me. My mother didn't ask how I was. They sat down, and my father pulled out a folder like he was presenting evidence, slid a paper toward me, and said they needed $10,000 now to keep the bank from taking the place, which is my emergency fund for 6 months. 10,000 was the today number. The real number was what he wouldn't say. My sister arrived late, pushing a stroller, and she looked exhausted and angry at the same time, which I would have felt bad about if I didn't know how quickly she turned exhaustion into entitlement. My father slid papers across the table and said, "This is what we're dealing with." It was bank notices, contractor invoices, and letters that made my stomach clench because even without understanding every term, I could see the pattern. Overdue, overdue, overdue. My father started explaining how the building just needed a little more to be finished, how once it was repaired they could rent it and everything would be fine, and I could hear the delusion in his voice. He sounded like a gambler insisting the next bet would fix the last bet. My mother leaned in and whispered, "We wouldn't ask if we had another choice." And because they had choices, they just didn't like them. They could sell the building at a loss. They could downsize. They could ask their golden child to get a job that actually covered her bills. Instead, they were sitting across from me like I was their emergency exit. My sister tried to make it about the baby, because that's her best weapon now. She pulled the blanket back to show me this tiny face, and for a second my heart did soften, because I'm not made of stone, and babies are unfairly disarming. Then my sister said, "This is your niece," in this pointed voice, like the word niece was supposed to unlock my wallet. I said, "She's beautiful," and my sister immediately said, "So help us," like she couldn't even wait for the compliment to land. My father asked, flat out, for a loan. "Not a gift," he said, "a loan," like adding that label made it reasonable. He threw out numbers in his head and I cut him off and asked for a specific amount, and he hesitated, because he didn't want to say it out loud. When he finally said it, my stomach flipped, because it was an amount that would wipe out our savings, and then some. My husband wasn't there, because I wanted to handle it alone, but in that moment I wished he was, just to ground me. I told my father I couldn't do it. He got red in the face and said, "You can," like my no was a temporary inconvenience. My mother started crying again, and my sister rolled her eyes like tears were a tool she'd seen used 1,000 times. My father looked at me and said, "If you do this, we can put the past behind us." And I said, "That's not how that works." And then, because he can't help himself, he brought up my husband again, saying if I'd married the right kind of man, maybe none of this would have happened, and I felt this cold clarity settle over me. Even now, even while asking for help, he needed to remind me I was still wrong in his eyes. I stood up, pushed the folder back toward him, and I said, "You need to sell the building." My father said, "We'd lose money." And I said, "You're losing money now." My mother asked what about my grandmother, And I said my grandmother shouldn't have signed anything if she didn't understand it. And that sounded harsh even to me. But I was so tired of being responsible for everyone's bad decisions. My sister hissed that I was cruel, and I said, "No, I'm finally being realistic." And then I walked out, heart pounding. And I sat in my car for a long time with my forehead on the steering wheel, shaking, because even when you choose yourself, it still hurts. That night, my cousin texted me, nervous, saying my parents were telling everyone I refused to help and that I was heartless. And I almost threw my phone across the room. It was like they couldn't even lose privately. They had to perform victimhood publicly. I asked my cousin one thing. Did my sister's husband steal anything? Or was that just my father's story? My cousin replied with 3 words. He didn't. And my stomach dropped, even though I already knew. Against my better judgment, I reached out to my sister's husband. Not in some dramatic way, just a simple message asking if he could confirm what happened, because my parents were spinning stories and I was being dragged back into it. I expected him to ignore me. Instead, he replied within an hour, and his message was so calm, it almost felt unreal. He said he never stole a cent from my parents. He said my father begged him to help fix the building, to handle contractors, to put his name on things, and he refused because he wasn't going to drown for someone who treated him like dirt. He said the marriage ended when he found out about the affair, and yes, he demanded a paternity test. And yes, he was done the second the truth was undeniable. He didn't sound cruel, either, which somehow made it worse, because it meant my sister couldn't even pretend he was a monster. He said he tried to keep things private, but my parents started telling people he was a thief, and he wasn't going to carry that lie. He offered to forward me a couple messages from my father where my father basically admitted the building was their responsibility. And I stared at my screen feeling this weird mix of satisfaction and nausea, because being right didn't feel good. It just felt heavy. I asked him carefully if there was any reason my parents were so terrified of police involvement, and he said, because they'll have to explain the loans and the paperwork, and they don't want anyone looking too closely. He said it like it was obvious. He also said my sister was pushing for money because the baby's father was unreliable and mostly working temporary jobs, and my sister was furious that her approved life didn't protect her from consequences. I could practically hear my sister screaming at the universe through his calm sentences. When I told my husband about the conversation, he didn't gloat. He just looked sad for me. He said, "They built their whole identity around being right, and now being right is costing them everything." I nodded, and for a second I felt that old urge to swoop in and rescue them anyway, just to prove I wasn't like them, just to prove I was good. Then I remembered my father's face in the coffee shop when he brought up my husband as an insult even while asking for help, and my urge died. I texted my parents one last time, not to argue, just to set a boundary. I said I knew the truth. I knew they lied about my sister's husband stealing. I knew the building was their gamble and I wouldn't be funding it. I told them they needed to stop telling people I was the reason they were suffering, because I wasn't. My father replied with one sentence, "So you're choosing strangers over your own blood?" And I stared at that message and thought, no, I'm choosing reality over your fantasy, but I knew he wasn't capable of hearing that. They didn't take my boundary well, which I know is shocking, because my family has always been famous for respecting me. 2 days later, my doorbell rang in the early evening, right when my husband and I were trying to eat dinner in peace. And when I checked through the window, my parents were standing on my porch like they belonged there. My sister was behind them with the stroller, and my first thought was, oh my God, they're doing this. They're using my address like it's a public meeting spot. I opened the door but kept the screen locked, because I'm not stupid, and my father started talking immediately. Not even hello, just, we need to talk. My husband stepped beside me, calm but firm, and my mother looked past him like he wasn't even a person, like her daughter was a piece of furniture she was there to reclaim. My father tried to push the conversation into the doorway, and I said, no, outside. My sister huffed and said, you're being dramatic, and I almost laughed because she would. They stood there and unloaded their panic onto my porch. My mother cried. My father threatened. My sister acted offended that I wasn't grateful for her presence. My father said the bank was moving forward, that they had days, that my grandmother was calling nonstop, and he said it all like it was my responsibility to absorb. My mother said, we raised you, and I said, you raised me with conditions. My father snapped, don't start, and my husband said, quietly, she can start if she wants. That was when my father finally looked at my husband, and his face did that tight thing, the look he saves for people he thinks are beneath him. My sister suddenly started talking about the baby again, rocking the stroller like she was presenting evidence. She said, "You're going to let her suffer." And I said, "She's not suffering right now. You're the one spiraling." My sister's eyes flashed and she hissed, "You're so cold." And I said, "I'm tired." My mother tried to step closer, reaching for the screen like she was about to grab my hand, and I stepped back. She froze like I'd slapped her, and for a second I saw how offended she was that I was allowed to have a body that didn't belong to her. My father lowered his voice, like he was trying a different tactic, and he said, "If you help, we can fix this. We'll accept your husband. We'll come to holidays. We'll be a family again." He said it like it was a generous offer, and I felt my throat tighten because the little girl in me still wanted that, still wanted to be chosen, but the adult me heard it clearly. It was another transaction. I said, "You can't buy your way back into my life with promises you didn't mean for years." My father said, "So that's it?" And I said, "Yeah, that's it." My sister lost it. She started yelling that I always thought I was better than them, that I married someone different, just to spite our parents, that I ruined her life by refusing to help. And my husband finally said louder, "You ruined your own life by lying and cheating and letting your parents blame everyone else." It got quiet in that instant, like someone cut the power, and my sister stared at him like she couldn't believe someone had spoken to her like that. My mother gasped like he swore in church, and my father stepped forward, angry, and my husband didn't move. He just held his ground. No yelling, no threats, just a calm wall. A neighbor walked by on the sidewalk and slowed down, and my mother suddenly got embarrassed, wiping her face fast, because public image is her religion. My father saw the neighbor too and shifted into a smaller voice, still angry but more controlled, and he said, "Fine, we'll remember this." My mother said, "You're doing this to us." And I said, "No, you did this to you." And my voice shook, but it didn't break. When they still wouldn't leave, my husband asked me if I wanted him to call for help, and I hated that it had come to that. But I nodded, because boundaries without enforcement are just wishes. My father scoffed when he heard that, like it was ridiculous. But then when my husband actually pulled out his phone, my parents backed up like the porch suddenly became dangerous ground. My mother whispered, "Don't." And my father grabbed her arm like he was steering her away from humiliation. My sister stood there a second longer, eyes wet and furious, and she said, "You're going to regret this." And I said, "Maybe, but not today." Then they finally left, and I closed the door and locked it, and I leaned against it shaking, because it still wiped me out. After they left, my husband and I stood in the kitchen staring at each other, the dead coffee maker still sitting there like a witness, like we'd just survived a storm that hit only our house. He asked, "What do you want to do now?" And the answer came out clean. I said, "I'm blocking them, not as drama, just as maintenance, like tightening a loose screw." I sent one last text first, because apparently I still like closing doors with words. I wrote, "You don't miss me. You miss the idea of my money. Sell the building and stop using a baby as leverage." Then I blocked my mother, my father, my sister, and my grandmother, and my phone went quiet in a way that felt almost suspicious. And yeah, I still get that ache around holidays, but my father's acceptance speech cured a lot of it. My cousin texted me later with updates. They sold the building, and the sale kept my grandmother's house safe for now. He said they were still calling me ungrateful at church, and my sister was still protecting the baby's father. I read it, took a breath, and that morning the coffee maker was dead, so I made tea, turned my phone face down, and let the silence be mine.